Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sophia. I organize Spectrum webinars for you, bringing the community together through learning at Spectrum. For those of you who are new to Spectrum, we are located at Duo Tower. So aside from providing event spaces, we offer curated workspaces for the community experience, bringing together members and providing the connections and resources to expand businesses. So today's webinar is in a special format, a dialogue session to discuss on investing in she economy, combining social impact and financial returns. We have two amazing ladies with us today. First up, Virginia Tan, founding partner of Teja Ventures, the first gender-lens VC fund for emerging Asia. Virginia's background is in law and finance, specializing in emerging market investments, and has covered more than $30 billion of transactions in the course of her career. Virginia was selected by the Rockefeller Foundation as one of the next generation leaders for its Beijing 25 Plus Summit in 2020, and recently made Singapore's 100 Women in Tech inaugural list in recognition for significant contribution in the tech sector. So to facilitate this dialogue, we have Cindy Teo, Associate Director with Golden Equator Ventures. Cindy has investment, operational, and management experience across banking, clean energy, and aviation industries. She has helped startups secure partnerships with tech giants, enter new markets, hire key management, and expand strategic networks. So Golden Equator Ventures is a venture capital firm that invests in high growth technology companies in Southeast Asia and offers global investors access to Southeast Asia's emerging tech opportunities. So audience, before we start, if you have any questions, please post them here and they'll be addressed after the dialogue. So without further ado, Cindy, over to you, please.
Thank you, Sophia, and welcome, Virginia. Thanks for joining us today. Well, Teja Ventures is an interesting name. What does Teja mean?
That's a great question. Teja is a Sanskrit word, and in Sanskrit, it means fire, it means energy, it means power, but more inner power. The person who actually explained to me what it meant was the Undersecretary of the United Nations. She and I were both fellow keynote speakers at a sort of a biannual women's conference that Jack Ma holds for Alibaba in Hangzhou. And basically I was telling her that Teja was the name that I'd chosen for my fund, and she actually explained to me what that meant. So, I felt it was a good name, a power, sort of to empower, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's very much aligned with your personality as well. Do tell us about your journey.
It's been an interesting journey and a probably unconventional one into venture capital and technology. I spent the early years of my career in law and finance. I started my career in London. I focused really on emerging market investments, and I basically spent the first decade of my career in Europe, in the Middle East, and then in China, working on emerging market investments. I had moved to Beijing in 2013 to work on investments relating to the One Belt, One Road. And that's where my life changed dramatically. So what was essentially a weekend sort of hobby. So when I first moved to Beijing, I had very little friends. And so I met a group of professional women, and on the weekends we started to hold events and sort of community type gatherings for young women like us. But I think everything in life is about right time, right place. And what essentially was, what started off as 10 people and then 100 and then 1,000, was basically the beginnings of a women's community, which eventually reached more than 100,000 women across 30 cities in China. So, I was still a lawyer working on the Belt and Road, and this community, which was called Lean in China, took off in a big way. So in less than 3 years, I had 100,000 over women. And I think I came to a point in my career whereby, I was either going to make partner or I was going to take a risk and try to see where this would lead. And and so I, as my mom says to my foolishness, I chose the latter to take a risk, very sort of unlawyer-like and unprofessional-like. And I didn't really know where that would go. So what essentially happened is that I decided to build what became one of China's most famous nonprofit organizations for women, and we had several national sort of initiatives. We focused on women and women leadership. We worked with 150 universities to train women leaders. It was the largest program of its kind in China. We worked on publishing data of women in the workplace. Again, one of the first to actually do that, working with a lot of the big Chinese companies like Tencent, Ctrip, etc. In a country with 400 million working women, there was very little data on working women. And then finally, what led me actually to Teja Ventures essentially was we started a small volunteer initiative in 2015, a startup pitch competition for women in technology startups. And, I remember that, it was May 2015. We were in a tiny room in Zhongguancun, which is sort of the tech hub of China, of Beijing, with 150 people, 10 startups pitching, and the CEOs of funds, which have now become very, very big in China, like Zhen Fund, like 36KR, like Sinovation Works. I think they're all huge now. And this was the beginning of what we call She Loves Tech, which is now the world's largest startup competition for women in technology. This year, in our 6th year, we are in 30 countries across 6 continents. We receive about 2,000 over startups a year, and our top, I would say 20 startups from the last few years have raised in total more than $150 million. So I think in 2016, when this competition really started to take off, I remember Sequoia China put in money into our first place winner in China. I know in subsequent years, people like Amazon, Tim Draper, Vertex put in money to our winners, in Singapore and Israel and the United States. And that's when I started to realize, is there an opportunity that we're actually missing here? And that's actually how Teja Ventures was born, to build the investment case for what I saw as the she economy opportunity.
Very interesting. When it comes to the she economy, it seems to be a big focus on women related activities. Can you share a little bit more about what the she economy is?
Absolutely. And I actually also have some slides I would like to share with everybody on this. So everybody can also take a look at the screen. Sophia, please share some of those slides.
Yeah, and just to pick up quickly on a Q&A that came in live, is the name of the community is Lean in China.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So next slide, please. So what Teja Venture does essentially is we invest in early stage technology companies for the she economy. So what is the she economy? The she economy is the market which targets women as consumers, or women consumers essentially, or what I call targets markets where women are market makers. So exactly, what kind of opportunity, are we actually looking at, right? What I have right now is women on the left, and the internet economy in Southeast Asia, which is where Teja Ventures actually focuses its investing in. Essentially, the she economy is what women consumers are actually spending on. And unlike what a lot of people think, okay, in the early days, people used to ask me, Virginia, why are you only focusing on 50% of the market when you can actually look at 100% of the market? And my answer to them was, I am not focusing on 50% of the market because women consumers actually control 80% of global discretionary spending. So and I think, the beauty of the years and years when we actually built and managed communities of young women who fueled by technology were living, consuming, working, and wanting, different things, by virtue of technology. I had a front row seat to that, of how they were shaping essentially new consumption patterns. In China, we call it new retail models, or sort of consumption upgrade. So if you look at the slide on the left, we have women as consumers, multiple markets in one. Like I said, they buy on behalf of themselves and their households. When we look at online traffic numbers, women are actually more active online. 55% of women purchase online versus 36% of men. Women spending 30% more time on social networks. They're also more likely to interact with brands, on social media or online, and they're more likely to buy through their friends as well. And then you look at trends towards a mobile workforce. Of course, COVID-19 has sort of pushed this all very sharply into focus, right? But 870 million will enter the global workforce in the next 10 years. But by the very nature of the fact that women, have to juggle sort of multiple sort of responsibilities, the trends towards flexible and remote work actually, are actually an asset and will benefit women. And then what we've seen, or what I've been able to see in the last 7 years while I was in China, essentially is the rise of what we term the she economy has coincided hugely with the rise of the internet economy. And I think now we're at a really interesting time in Southeast Asia, whereby that has reached a critical inflection point and accelerated by COVID-19. Online spending set to triple, from 2019 to 2025. We have the most engaged mobile, users in the world. 90% of them use the mobile phone to actually access the internet. So like China, they jumped mobile first. And, digital transformation, which is expected to add $1 trillion in GDP by 2025, is only going to be accelerated by COVID. Next slide, please. So we built Teja Ventures, because we really believed that the she economy is the largest arbitrage opportunity of our generation. Now, what does that actually mean? What we felt was that, or what we saw through the data, of running these communities and actually seeing, the tech ecosystem boom in China, was that women were both the biggest drivers and beneficiaries of new business models in the internet economy. Of course, there are going to be exceptions, like, for example, gaming, or for example, purchasing electronics, for example. But in many parts, a lot of these new business models in the internet economy, we saw that, women were drivers of revenue, regardless of whether these companies were female orientated or not, particularly in the internet, mobile, social media sort of spaces, right? And digitalization, and the internet economy were enabling women to actually not just scale and monetize these behaviors. They were often first adopters of new consumption behavior for themselves, but as a conduit also to their households and communities. So Teja Ventures decided to start investing in technology-driven companies that leverage upon women as a demographic, whether it's consumers, online traffic, mobile workforce, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at the right side of the screen, a lot of these new business models that we saw rising, new retail models, content-driven, influencer-driven, the increasing digitalization of services, and the rise of digital payments. We saw the she economy actually at the heart of that. I want to give one example because I think it's always easier to talk about specific verticals. Something which really surprised me, I wasn't expecting to find this out, was that when I worked with all these communities, huge communities of aspiring women, who aspiring essentially to a better life in China, I noticed something. So when I talked to a lot of big education companies, professional education or K-12 education companies, what I noticed was actually the majority, I would say 70 to 80% of paid content users were very often women. And why? I was like, wow, that's a bit much. And the reason why was because they had historically had a harder time climbing the career ladder. They were facing more obstacles, as women in the workplace. And that was what my organization was essentially focused on, that they were willing to invest and spend more on professional education, especially when it was digital, because it meant that women who were traditionally time poor could actually, gain the benefit of sort of, in Chinese, they say 知识付费, right? Which is knowledge consumption, in bite-sized pieces at a very cheap price, and from the comfort of their homes or their offices. Yeah. So that was the very first kind of realization that, hold on, there's definitely an opportunity here. I looked at, for example, we know the company VIP Kid quite well. I think I was also surprised that 90% of their mobile workforce, which is essentially teachers, 90% or more than 90% of their teachers are women, because they were essentially using, the business model essentially allowed them to use spare pockets of their time to earn extra income, and this actually worked for them. Next slide, please. And the other thing, again, which COVID-19 has sort of shown us, is that, I mean, we set up Teja Ventures end of 2018, and obviously we never thought that COVID would come, but by actually targeting the core needs revolving around the life cycle of women, what we've actually noticed in our portfolio is that it's led to sort of a counter-cyclical effect. A lot of these verticals that we place our bets on were meant, way before COVID. But I think in some ways COVID has helped to accelerate some of these trends and some of these needs, and these are core needs, and so therefore less affected by economic downturns. And so I think in a strange way, COVID-19 is actually helping us to prove that thesis. Next slide, please. And these are just some of the key trends for the she economy in which we're excited about and that we're doubling down on in Southeast Asia. And again, even though a lot of these bets were made before COVID, we're starting to see that COVID-19 is actually accelerating all of these trends. These are some of the areas which we know will benefit from what's happening, and that acceleration of digital transformation across Southeast Asia.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. What I was saying is, it looks like you have really a broad coverage when it comes to the areas to invest in. So how did you start Teja Ventures, and who are the partners you started it with?
Yeah. So, very interestingly, I think when I first started Lee in China and then She Loves Tech, to be honest, these were great accidents of my life. I didn't necessarily think that this is what we would end up doing, but I think it became very, very clear, to me that, I think first through building these huge communities, really understanding what consumers, or in this case, female consumers, are thinking, what they're buying, what they need. And then, essentially building these huge proprietary pipelines of deals without necessarily thinking about, building a fund later on. I think essentially what I started to see was that the she economy was really, an opportunity which was untapped. And I think that's essentially, why I decided to start Teja Ventures. I also realized that, there was not enough capital necessarily going into a lot of these areas. And I felt that, women, not just as consumers, as entrepreneurs, as consumers, as a mobile workforce, they all could stand, to benefit if we could build a fund really focused on investing in some of these technologies, which leverage women as market makers. And I think, next slide, please. I think, what I was also very lucky to do is that in all the years that I had been building these communities, whether of entrepreneurs, of corporates, or female consumers, I was lucky enough, I think, to meet a team which had very similar shared values, a lot of alignment in terms of that vision. So, what I essentially started to do is, I think I spent about a year in 2017, just really working on that thesis, really, spending a lot of time just on the data, strengthening, investment thesis based on the trends that we were seeing, based on what we felt, was going to take off. And actually, I think I remember the first person I actually ever showed my deck to is one of the most famous investors in India. He was a mentor of mine. His name is Vineet Rai. He manages about $500 million. His fund is called Avishkar. And I went to see him. I remember that was February 2017 on my birthday, actually. And I remember him saying, essentially that, Virginia, you shouldn't look at women just as a screen. You should really try to understand what the real opportunity is. So it's not just about ticking the box. Oh, like, okay, they're a female entrepreneur, female CEO. Okay, you should fund them. He said, take away, don't just think of them as a screen. Think of what the real opportunity is and focus on that. And I think after that, as I built that team up, May, for example, she was a mentor of mine, my advisory board for a long time, in our community, but, she comes from a private equity and consumer operational background. She was an SVP at Walmart, 20 over years in consumer industries. And then she moved to Hopu and Fuxing to actually work on their cross-border she economy portfolio, mother and baby, family related, personal care. So I think for us, to basically really build that fund was kind of a clear next step. I think David, is our partner sort of in Indonesia, does a lot of the sourcing there. Indonesia is a key market for Teja's first fund. And again, I met him through She Loves Tech. We helped to co-organize She Loves Tech in Indonesia. When I did my first deal, so I started off angel investing. I had no plans necessarily to do a fund, but I decided that I really wanted to put some of my own money into some of these deals coming out of She Loves Tech. And so when I did my first deal, David was the person who literally helped me do my legal documents. And then when it was clear that we were going to build Teja Ventures, then it was clear that David, and I would shape that investment thesis and source and do deals together. And then Michael, I think, also came from my community in Beijing. And he was, a big proponent of the she economy. He was organizing a lot of she economy conferences. He's a cross-border venture capital investor. He invests, in data-driven models in the US and China. And it was just very clear that the four of us, just had that shared passion, shared belief in the she economy. Michael was bringing me deals and women entrepreneurs way before I even had a fund. And I think it's shared values like that which really bring a team together. And I feel privileged to work with people who have that experience and share the same passion.
Yeah, for sure. Bringing complementary skills to the table is really important. But as a new fund, how did you get your first investor?
I mean, that is a great question. My very first investor was actually my oldest friend in the world. They talk about when you first start fundraising, you should go with family and friends first. I didn't really take that very seriously. I wasn't quite sure who I would go to. He's the oldest friend in the world. We went to primary school together in Singapore. I've known him since I was 6. He's a senior investment banker now. And we were at a friend's wedding, and I told him about my idea, and he said, "Okay, let me put in the first check," and that was it. And I remember the second check was a very senior businesswoman who had known me for many years through Lean in China. Had been a speaker for us. She was working for a huge. She was basically the head of a huge financial institution in China. And one day we had coffee, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm thinking of building a gender lens fund." And so she decided to put down the first $500,000 check. I know it sounds like easy. It definitely wasn't. It definitely isn't. It's just, I think so much about fundraising is actually looking for the people who are really truly aligned with you in values and in vision. Because I think obviously it's a little different now that we have 10 portfolio companies, whereas in the beginning when you had very little, people are really betting on that potential. And to be honest, I was terrified at the very beginning. I was terrified. Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of our audience members can, I identify with what you're saying, because a lot of entrepreneurs don't really realize that investors who are operating institutional funds also have to go through that journey of fundraising. So how have you grown from the fundraising journey?
I like this question a lot. I often tell people, I said, yeah, I've been fundraising, last 1.5 years. But in many ways, I feel like the fund is raising me. How have I grown in the fundraising journey? I think the first thing is that I used to take every rejection pretty personally, have a little sob about it. But actually, I think, rejection is actually very healthy. And I think the key is actually that every no is a pathway to yes. You have to look at it. And I think the key is not to focus on the no, but the key is actually really to focus on the reasons behind the no. And to understand, is it that, okay, the product's not good enough? Is it that I haven't addressed some questions, or some issues or some red flags, for them? Or is it that, simply not their thing? And I think, I didn't realize that, fundraising is a full-time job, and I think it's really interesting to have a product-driven mindset. We're investing in technology companies at the end of the day. I think in many ways, fundraising, you have to take a product-driven mindset to that. You have to have your funnel of potential investors. You have to basically, in Chinese, we say 用户画像, which is like user profile. You have to sort of understand who are the most likely people to actually want to invest in you, especially when you have had some investors. And I think, to keep sort of, being targeted, being focused on people who share those same values as you, especially when you're raising a first-time fund. And it's very, very humbling. It's very, very humbling. I think I've done on my deck, to be honest with you, at least 200 times, I would say. And every time like you've done it, you're like, okay, I finally gotten it. I finally, have made it. This is the perfect one. And then you do it again. But I think it's that process. I think it's that process which actually you grow from, and it's humbling, but it's also rewarding.
Yeah, understand that the preferred stage of investment is pre-A, and Teja Ventures aims to be the first institutional track. Why is that? Is there a progression from your angel investing days?
I think first of all, you need to look at the DNA of your team, right? So out of the, the 4 members of our team, 3 of us are really early stage investors. So for example, David, he runs the largest angel investment network in Indonesia. He looks at, I would say a lot of like the early stage deals in Indonesia go through his network. He's had 4 exits, Michael similar. So, and I think the 3 of us, really truly enjoy working with early stage entrepreneurs. But I think, in terms of from a strategy perspective, it's more than that. I think it's very hard to go out and build another Sequoia. So I think as a young fund, as a first time fund, you have to play differently. So apart from the strengths of the partners, the reason why we wanted to go in at either seed or pre-A is because I think Teja Ventures, we don't really do spray and pray approach. We're working to become the go-to fund in the she economy here in Southeast Asia, and we provide not just capital, but we want to be partners to entrepreneurs. And I think the beauty about going in early, I think there are 4 things that we enjoy doing when we work with entrepreneurs. The first thing is, the ability to really, I think, coach the entrepreneur, but also to shape, and really figure out what those early value drivers could be. So, I mean, we can go through some of the companies later, but I think, for example, some companies, when we first invested in them, they're very early. So maybe they hadn't built their tech yet. Well, they just had, a basic MVP. And at that time, you could really, using the she economy expertise that we have, understanding what kind of consumers, what kind of mobile workforce they should be targeting, can give them really, really good sort of strategic advice, which will, basically simplify their journey. We have, huge networks, so helping them with even things like co-founders or, great talent. But I think, a key part, I think, is what we call, the technology bit. I mean, the technology part, when we talk about applying technology, it's not always like, okay, we're not going to build that technology system for you. But a lot of times I think it's about really understanding, the sort of the technology business model and understanding and learning from the experience that we've had in China. I don't believe that you can just apply and duplicate what China has done wholesale in Southeast Asia. So that's not what I'm advocating. But I think because of the makeup of the team, one of the the key strengths of the fund is what we call China Southeast Asia arbitrage. To take a lot of the learnings of what we've seen succeed and fail, given that I believe there's about a 7 to 10 year time lag between China and Southeast Asia, and really help founders to sort of apply that at a really early stage, so that they that hopefully saves them time in figuring out the right product fit and business model. And I think finally, is we have extensive networks actually in the she economy, extensive strategic resources. Sometimes applying that strategic resource very early on, like for example, if we have a company doing refillable FMCG and just linking them up to one of the big FMCG companies, for example, that's May's background, making sure that their supply chain is a little or their cash flow cycle is better right at the beginning, can really help them out in the long run. So I think that's why we like to go in early, because we feel like that's the time when you can actually have material impact on the shape of the company, and also unlock that economic value even at the early stage.
For a young fund, having 10 portfolio companies is actually really good. How did you source for your first few portfolio companies?
I mean, like I said, Sophia, maybe you could show the next slide. Yeah, I mean, our first few portfolio companies, I think we sourced them in a couple of ways. So for example, Burgreens is one of our portfolio companies. It's Indonesia's leading plant-based food brand, focusing on alternative meat proteins for the Asian consumer. Chicken and beef are their main products. How do we source for Burgreens, for example? Burgreens was invested in by many angels from my venture partners, David's angel investment network. So he's been with them for years, like 5 years essentially. And now when they're at a time where, they're about to really take off, in a big way, now's the right time for example, Teja to come in. But I've known about Bergreens, for, I would say, at least 2 years. And when Teja invested sort of earlier this year, the whole point about us investing was, Bergreens was essentially an F&B company, 10 stores around Jakarta, already EBITDA positive. But when we sat down with the founders, we started to realize that their real skill, or their real sort of strengths, was actually in product innovation. We discussed with them, saying, we put in the money, would they do two things? One thing was to build a CPG product. And the second thing was to basically increase, the online offline ratio of sales, launch direct to consumer channels. They've done both of that during COVID in the period of 4 months. And they will end the year EBITDA positive, $2 million of revenue. And essentially now everybody is now knocking on the doors, because now their transformation into a CPG company is actually, it has essentially begun. So that's an example of how we sourced. And next slide, please. Yeah, I mean, Click Daily, again, one of our I would say top performing companies. We sourced them through, another VC who was a very close friend of me and David. Essentially, let us look at the company when the company was doing less than $2 million GMV. That was in December 2018. As of this year, they're doing about 4+ million GMV per month. So this year they will probably reach 50 million at the end of the year. So that's a 20x growth in less than 2 years. And like I said, some of the best deals obviously come from a lot of the networks that we've built up over the years with She Loves Tech, with Lean in China with Onion. Next slide. And this company, for example, Do It Ape, again, we went in very, very early when they were less than $1 million. And this was our number 2 winner for She Loves Tech in 2017. I was essentially mentoring the startup, before the finals, as part of what She Loves Tech does, right, with the portfolio companies who make the finals in each country. And, had the opportunity to see this company grow up. Of course, we didn't know COVID would come. So their GTV has grown 20x essentially since Q1 of this year. But, like I said, so a lot of these verticals were things which were positively impacted by COVID, but we didn't actually necessarily expect it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I was just about to ask the obligatory COVID question about how COVID-19 impacted your investment strategy. So even if these companies in the portfolio have benefited in a way from COVID, or have managed to navigate the changed environment well, are you looking at future investments taking into consideration COVID-19's impact?
Like everybody else, we went into COVID-19 really quite afraid. But out of our portfolio of 10 companies, all 10 companies are fine. I would say all have runway of about 12 months. 70% of our portfolio companies raised new money during COVID. Like I said, a lot of these verticals unexpectedly being the positively impacted ones. I think COVID-19 has actually made us feel more confident about the sort of the she economy thesis. During COVID, actually, we've been doubling down on investments as opposed to sort of stepping back, because we now know that, we believe this is the right strategy. But I also think that from a COVID-19, even before COVID-19, we were quite focused on looking at economic fundamentals anyway, staying away from companies which burned too much money anyway. And a lot of she economy verticals, are actually quite cash flow positive as well. So, out of the 10 companies, for example, 2 are already EBITDA positive. So, but I think, in light of COVID-19, we will definitely be keeping sort of strong eye on the economic fundamentals of each of these companies. Yeah. Apart from just growth and burn. Yeah.
Yeah, as an investor, I agree. It's important to do a lot of research on the sectors to invest in to begin with, and also factor new information into the logic of investing. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot from your sharing, Virginia. So now for the Q&A section, Sophia, over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thanks very much for that. And also, Virginia, great sharing. So let us get to the questions right now. Great questions here. So first question from Pedro Oliveira. Thank you, Pedro, for your question. What's your advice, do towards making such an impact?
Sorry, what's my advice to doing what?
To do towards making such an impact?
You know, it's really interesting. I think that when I think of impact, and you know, we invest in sort of technology companies, right? When I think of impact, I think a lot of people are now turning towards ESG. There's more interest in that, more openness, which I'm obviously very grateful for. But I think that when we think about making an impact, you know, impact shouldn't be ancillary. You know, so ESG used to be like more of a tick the box exercise, or ESG was seen as a risk mitigant. But I think we should really think about impact as an opportunity, because what I think COVID has really shown us is that what was, you know, nice to have, sustainable, socially good, is now becoming essential and urgent. So I'll give you an example of a company that we have, which I'm actually really excited about. It's a company which does sort of refillable FMCG. So what they do essentially is that, you know, so for example, you know, in mass market, let's not talk about Singapore, because I think Singapore is an anomaly in Southeast Asia, but in mass market FMCG, you know, a lot of times, let's say people who are below middle class, what they'll do is that when they buy FMCG, they buy packets of things, right? They buy these little sachets of things. They don't buy bottles because it's too expensive. But sachets, for example, of things from a unit economics perspective, are actually more expensive. They're buying less for more, essentially. And also obviously with plastic, you know, it's just a lot of plastic disposal. So what this company essentially is doing is that it sets up IoT powered mobile stations, you know, in mom and pop shops, and then people can buy FMCG essentially without packaging, right? They just bring a bottle and they fill it up. But what's actually very interesting is that this works out to be 20-30% cheaper for the consumer. For the, you know, we save plastic because there's no packaging. And so, for example, when I met that company, the first thing I told them to do was, like, when they were just like essentially mobile carts, and I said, you know, you really need to be building data analytics so that, you know, big FMCGs, when they work with you, they understand who's buying what, where, in what quantities, essentially. And you need, you know, for your business model to work, essentially, I don't really think you can have it manned all the time. So you might want to think of IoT, etc. So you understand who's buying what, you know, automate the process. Now, I would say about 2 years ago, I was definitely seeing a lot less of this kind of what was called sustainable or socially good. And in the last 6 months, for example, everybody from like all the huge FMCGs have been basically chasing the startup, because what was socially good, sustainable before, is now becoming essential, because now they're realizing, okay, how do we increase market share in these markets, right? In, you know, bottom of the pyramid or sort of working class. How do we do this in a sustainable way, you know, without plastic? And for example, one of the things that I noticed, which is one of the reasons why I invested very early, was that I noticed that the Indonesian government, for example, is slowly banning plastic, single-use plastic. For example, in a place like Bali, that's where it started, etc. And so I was thinking, okay, so this is an example whereby impact is not ancillary. It's not, okay, then I tick the impact boxes because it creates as many jobs, etc. Here, the impact that you create, which is like, it's cheaper for consumers, and the fact that you save plastic is at the heart of the business model. It's the reason why the economics, you know, will be better, and why actually more people will invest in them, and why the FMCGs are actually going, you know, crazy about this model right now, because it's something that they don't have and they haven't done. So again, that's how I would think about impact going forward. Think about how we can do things differently, right? And not, okay, let's make money and then we can have some impact later. But it's more like, how can we do things differently, which are impactful, and then make sure that these have sustainable business models which make financial sense. And the key to that, as what we believe at Teja, is technology. Because without technology, you can't actually reduce, you know, you can't have economies of scale. You can't reduce the operational cost of things. Regardless of whether you're looking at FMCG, you're looking at fintech, you're looking at health and wellness, technology to me is the key driver.
Fabulous. Right, the next question from Ami Ikeda. Thank you, Ami, for your question. Is Lean in China have activities only in Beijing? Are there any other big cities in China? And also, we'll talk about the slides later.
Yeah, I mean, Lean in China, we started off in Beijing, but essentially we were in, all of big tier 1 and tier 2 cities. So for example, we were in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hangzhou, Chengdu. I would say these were our main cities. And then we have, tier 2 cities like Kunming, we have Jinan, blah, 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 etc. And others. But the big cities I talked about, those were the main ones. And then we had about a network of about 100 plus universities in, I think, across, 30 over provinces. So, it was quite a large community.
Thank you. The next question from Nathan Slater. Thank you, Nathan, for your question. Are the SDGs considered when exploring the she economy? And if so, which SDGs and what indicators are used to ensure investments are ethical?
You know what? Thank you for that question. That's great. We've been working with an external consultant for the last 3 months over the summer, because I think because of my background the last 7 years, working with women, I think I had sort of taken the whole SDGs and the impact stuff for granted. In fact, for us, it was important that we built a sort of a commercial thesis, that we felt could be an investment case which could be defended, right? And really focus on that. And actually in the last 3 months, what we've been doing, and I've just been started to present it this week, actually. I haven't included it in these slides, is actually our gender lens methodology, our impact methodology, so to speak. Now, this is actually what we've found. I'll be very specific on the SDGs. What we realize is that, so our investment thesis essentially is, leveraging women as market makers. So that's where you get your financial returns, because essentially women are driving growth and revenue in certain areas of the internet economy, and we're focusing on that. So let's leveraging women as market makers. But at the same time, we realize that when you leverage women as market makers, because women are first adopters of new consumption patterns, at least in Asia, this is not true in all parts of the world, but at least in Asia, and especially East Asia, they essentially become conduits to either new markets, and at the same time, conduits of potential social change. Now, that's the part which essentially, I had just taken for granted. I hadn't thought about it from a methodology perspective. But so when we have our internal sort of what we call gender lens sort of metrics, right? When we look at an investment, the gender lens methodology is sort of applied from the sourcing all the way to post investment, right? We consider things like, for example, we invest in both male and female founders. We have 60% female, 40% male right now. But we actually look at, okay, does the business model indirectly or directly impact women in the ecosystem? Does the product actually primarily serve the female consumer, or solely or disproportionately? Does it address the gap in the market? Does it address better the gap in the issue in a more affordable or more accessible way, etc. So what we've actually found out is, while you empower women as market makers, or you leverage upon as women makers, they can also be conduits of social change. Now, the two underlying SDGs for the fund are actually SDG 5, which is gender equality, and the SDG 8, which is decent work and I think economic opportunities or something like that. So is SDG 8. And then, so because that works all across our thesis, right? Trying to bring more income, more economic opportunities, and better consumer options to women consumers when we invest. And then based on the actual vertical of, so for example, if you are investing in FMCG, sustainable consumption, investing in plant-based food, that's, climate change, for example. If you're investing in, for example, if you saw Do It Up just now, that was sort of digital aid distribution, that's no poverty. So I would say 5 and 8 are our core. And then depending on the vertical, you have the additional SDG.
Great. Okay, another question from Ami. How to be an angel investor? Must you be a business?
To be an angel investor? I mean, I don't think there's any criteria for being an angel investor. I think a lot of angel investors, I started out angel investing about 10 years ago, 2010. And the very first company I put in money to, was a friend's company. He was building, as crazy as it sounds, our car company in Africa. The car company is called Mobius. And to be honest, the first time he showed me the car, didn't even look like a car. He was trying to build an affordable car from for Africa. After the last 10 years, he's actually starting to manufacture his cars actually out of Kenya. So to be honest, I think you start off with an interest, right? You may be interested. I think as an angel investor, you may be interested in a particular vertical, and I think investing is the best way to actually to have an interest, right? And then I started to do a lot of advisory work with startups. So start off with interest and then advisory work through She Loves Tech competition. And I have a legal and finance background. So, but I think there's still a lot of learning that you have to do. So I think the only way you can really learn as an angel investor is to do deals, and you learn by doing. You can read books as well, but my suggestion is the best way to learn is through speaking with other investors, understanding industry practice, and just learning by doing it. Yeah.
Great. Okay, we are in good time. I have a couple of questions as well, Virginia. Does poverty in emerging markets limit the purchasing power of customers to support startups' monetization?
I think it depends on what we call poverty, right? I think it depends on what we call poverty. So, for example, I think the poverty line in Singapore is probably different from poverty line in India and Indonesia, and also, for example, in China. So, the way I want to, like, if we were using Singapore standards with Singapore things at Singapore costs, then I would say, yeah, it definitely would limit the purchasing power of consumers. But I think that is the whole beauty of, I think, technology and innovation, because if you think about it, the world has been designed for essentially the first 2 billion consumers. One of a big trend that I'm bullish on is what I call the next billion, or in this case, the next 4 billion consumers. Because essentially, whether you look at FMCG, you look at education, you look at healthcare, you look at commerce, it's essential, financial services is essentially been targeted at either urban or the first 2 billion consumers. So the question for me is, I think poverty doesn't necessarily limit the purchasing power of consumers if you actually built systems for them in the first place. Because one of the things that I noticed, we have 2 companies focusing on rural commerce, one in Indonesia, one in India, right? And for the longest time, I think VCs in India did not focus on rural commerce, even though India has 900 million rural consumers, and that's fair enough, because if an urban consumer sort of spent 5-6 times that of a rural consumer or more, then you probably, as a venture capitalist, you would invest in the urban startup. But I think the opportunity, and I think COVID has laid bare both the gaps in our system and the opportunity, is that the infrastructure to serve some of these consumers and these potential consumers is the opportunity is there. The infrastructure is missing. So whoever is able to build that infrastructure and use technology to drive down the cost and make it economic, or gain enough market share, there is a proposition in there. And that's essentially what we did with one of our portfolio companies called Frontier Markets in India, essentially because Indian logistics, logistics for rural India are poor. So what they do is they use women, women micro entrepreneurs essentially as mobile, agents. So you think of the Avon lady selling cosmetics in the US, think of the modern day Avon lady, but in India, but instead of selling cosmetics, she's selling energy, selling FMCG, she's selling more banking services. And she's armed with a smartphone, even though she can't really read, but she can look at pictures. So she's armed with a smartphone, and the consumer basically can essentially choose. She can, instead of like just talking to them and then calling a call center, she can book and buy in real time. And so I think it's about a different way of doing things, because what I've noticed from that startup, is that there is purchasing power in rural India. Just the question is, on what and how you're going to make the economics work for them, because it's clearly, untapped. Yeah.
So you play around with the quantity and the frequency of transactions rather than the price point. Is that?
To be honest with you, I think price points are key. I think I'd lie if I say that, okay, people can buy the same fridge that we're buying here in Singapore. I think I think the price points, definitely have to change. But for example, like in that particular company, right, their most popular SKU for a long time was a solar torch, because people need light. They need energy. It's just that they're not connected to the grid. So they can't buy like a fancy TV or like, because they have nothing to plug it into. So one of what the company started to do in the beginning was to sell solar fans, solar torches, and solar even TVs, because that's the only thing. And you know, I think something which I spend time doing is trying to understand what these people, if they had any increase in income, what would they actually buy? And some of those things might actually surprise us, because I think their needs are similar, except that maybe a lot of the goods and services were never designed for them to begin with.
So I've got another question by Pedro. How have you convinced and tried to convince investors to pursue more sustainable business models that, at least for short, medium term, may not be as profitable as other revenue streams? And how do you manage that relation?
I mean, it's funny you asked the question. I don't think I've needed to convince the investors who have invested in us that these models are not necessarily, less sustainable, or more sustainable. If you look at a lot of the biggest technology companies, none of their business models were sustainable at all. I mean, if you look at some of them, they're still loss making even today, and they're huge, right? They're worth billions of dollars. So I don't think, I'm not saying that we should invest in unsustainable business models, but I don't think that's really the question. I think at the end of the day, I think is, how do you convince an investor that this is the future, that this is the right, this is, I believe this is the largest arbitrage opportunity the she economy is. How do you convince them of that? And I think, I think you can't convince everybody. I think that's what I've learned, right? You can't convince everybody, and that's okay. But similarly, you got to find out who those first adopters are going to be, who are the investors who are more likely to support that, or actually can see or take a chance in investing in the future. And I think COVID-19 has accelerated that need and that openness. I think people are much more willing, much more open to actually investing in things that they may not have been considering before, because simply life has shown us, through no fault of our own, that some of the old ways do not work. So for example, the future of retail, maybe if you had malls which are thriving all the time, you would never have to consider the future of retail, because your malls are always full. But what happens when your malls are half full or empty? Then you have to really think about, okay, is there new online infrastructure which I can integrate with my offline infrastructure? Do I have to branch out to omni channels? Do I have to find direct to consumer channels, to bring down my costs, etc.? So I think I've never had to convince somebody about whether something was sustainable or not. It's just whether I think people believe that this is this is the future, and are willing to buy into that. Yeah.
Great. Okay, I have this question that I want to ask you. So I love it that you said, I love the enthusiasm. I love the what you do what you do, and you mentioned, but every no is a pathway to yes. So I'd like to know which women inspire and influence you professionally and personally.
Wow. Which women inspire me? I mean, they're quite a lot. I've been very privileged in my life. I think to meet people, not just women. I think women and men, and I think in China especially, a lot of women leaders who have shown me not just what it means to be a good leader, but actually what it means to be a great human being. And I really appreciate that. I think, for example, Jane Sun, who is the CEO of C-Trip, is a friend and a mentor of mine. I think C-Trip has probably been one of the hardest hit companies by COVID-19, since they're the second largest travel company in the world, and the largest in China. So, I think what someone like that, for example, has shown me is, the willingness to she always puts her team first. Before herself. Yesterday, we were on a webinar together, and I found out that she essentially, volunteered to take complete pay, like 100% pay cut, and her management 50%, and leading by example. The first thing she did was to set up, huge recovery funds to ensure that, number one, all of C-Trip's partners, they had lifelines to ensure that all refunds were given immediately to especially to stranded sort of customers, and another big fund, to ensure sort of cash flow positivity, to ensure sort of cash flow, for their partners, etc. So, in a time when things are hard, I think she shows me what it means to put, others first, which I think is a great trait in any leader. But I think in the early days, I think what actually the trigger factor for me to quit my job, as a lawyer at the time, was that I went to a conference in Peking University, and Jack Ma was the keynote speaker, and he said, women are leaders of the future because they care more for other people. And that day, I decided I put in my resignation. Yeah, but I think what I admire the most about someone like Jane, for example, is actually her kindness to people. She's achieved so much, won every single award, etc. I think it's leadership by example, and the fact that I think she maintains that humility and that kindness, and that generosity, and I deeply admire that, because I think no great things in life are ever done alone. And I think more people like that who you surround yourself with, the better your pathway is going to be. It's about being with the right people on the journey. I think I'm very thankful to my mother, for example. I think my mother has given me all the freedom in the world, to actually pursue what I want to pursue. I mean, yes, she gives me a lot of nagging sometimes, because being in she thinks being a venture capitalist is essentially being unemployed. That's in her words, right? Being an entrepreneur is to her unemployment. She thinks that that's not compared to being a lawyer or banker, which is fair. I take the point, but I think complete and total I think freedom to choose my own path. And I think I grew up with very little sort of boundaries or in a way limitations on what a woman could or could not do. In fact, like, in our family, we just didn't even understand that there was a difference, and I am very grateful for it now. You don't think about these things when you're younger. I mean, there have been a lot of great women that I've met actually over the years. And actually, the one thing I wanted to say, I mean, not necessarily about any particular one of them, because I think there's a great myth that for a woman to be very, very professionally successful, she has to sacrifice everything else. And the one thing that I noticed about the great women, or the women that I consider great or great leaders, is that actually the more successful they were, the most successful ones I knew were actually the ones with happy marriages and good families. And actually what I learned from them, or am still learning from them, I won't say I'm there yet, is actually, what balance looks like. I used to hate the word balance because I just work all the time, right? But I learned from them, what balance looks like, and what you're really being sure and being strong in your core actually means. And that's what I admire. I think I've still a lot more work to do with regards to balance, but I think I learned it from them. Yeah.
Thank you. So before we end the webinar, Cindy, anything to add? You'd like to add?
Yeah, I wanted to check in, Virginia, being an investor at the intersection of the she economy, technology, and emerging economies in Asia, will you give us 3 takeaways on where these opportunities are as a teaser leading up to the next webinar with you?
I think there are a couple of trends, I would say 3 main trends that sort of I'm excited about. I've touched on some of that before. I think the first trend I would say is what I call Gen Z. I think by 2025, 25% of Asia essentially will be Gen Z. They have 150 billion spending power. They're going to shop differently from us. 50% of Gen Z prefer direct to consumer instead of traditional retailers. Post-COVID, 62% of consumers already state that social media, short videos, messaging are their most preferred online channels for discovering new brands and products. So I think this will change our, the retail landscape, a lot more, and perhaps a lot faster than we think. The second thing that I'm excited about when it comes to the she economy actually is what I call the future of health and wellness. Increasingly personalized, online or integrated, AI assisted. Wellness is something, especially post-COVID, I'm very focused on. 50% of the, a 4.5 trillion global health expenditure market is actually going to be on wellness, which is preventative. I definitely, am spending a lot of time looking at that. Obviously, for example, mental health, 500 million people in Asia will struggle with a mental neurological disorder. And still that's something we have very little knowledge or even options on, unless you're very wealthy. And things like, telemedicine and sort of online infrastructure. I think, obviously in Singapore, we're less sort of affected because we're a wealthy country, but, I think, digital transformation is going to be key to the way we deliver care and access to services in emerging market countries, because I think COVID-19 has shown us that if such a crisis, we can't actually do things the same way. We simply can't afford to do that, and still serve people. We have to find ways to really bring down costs. And I think that the final, key trend, that I want to talk about a little bit more, which I mentioned already, is the next billion consumers. The next billion consumers, I would say, that 4 billion, that will grow to nearly 5 billion with a spend of about 55 trillion by 2030. The opportunities are going to be beyond our first tier cities, to second, third tier and rural areas. If you look at Pinduoduo, which is now worth more than 100 billion, right? Alibaba's closest contender in China, their core consumers at the beginning, 70% of them were women from third tier cities, not first or second tier. And 2/3 of these people, their spending is going to be on basic food, clothing, and housing, but they're not going to be spending on the same things as us. As in the same types of products as us. And the question is, how do we, design for them? How do we, what does that infrastructure look like and that distribution look like? And I think from a sheer economic perspective, I believe that women are conduits to these new markets. They are drivers of these new business models. I think in our portfolio, we have 2 companies on healthy food. 93% of women in Asia Pacific post-COVID are looking to change their diet in the next 12 months. So what does that actually tell us? Women more than men are likely to seek health information online. They make 90% of household healthcare decisions. Women are more likely to purchase through social media, and they value community and peer content. So I call that e-commerce, 2 3.0. 90% of sort of resellers, agents on social commerce platforms, the leading ones in Asia, at least, they're women too, and I think, that's essentially the way we're going to evolve. I just think COVID-19 has just accelerated some of these things because it's just shown us the gaps or the fact that things can be done differently.
Great, thank you.
Really
indeed.
hopeful.
Great, thank you. Indeed, a very fantastic dialogue session. Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, Cindy. We'd love to thank the audience as well. Thank you for joining us today. Do join us next week on a breakfast session webinar on the ROI of investing in lives with Agape Connecting People. So before you exit the webinar, please submit your feedback after the session. So thank you, keep safe and stay well as well. Thank you very much. See you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.